Imagine spending years cracking thousands of secret Nazi messages, dismantling entire spy rings across South America, and bringing down international drug smugglers during Prohibition. Now imagine watching as J. Edgar Hoover stands at a microphone on national radio, describing in dramatic detail how his FBI agents solved all these cases while you sit at home, legally forbidden from saying a single word in your own defense. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality for Elizebeth Smith Friedman, America's first female cryptanalyst, whose groundbreaking codebreaking work remained buried under government classification for decades, while one of the most powerful men in America built his legend on her achievements. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how one woman created the entire science of American cryptanalyst, how she almost single-handedly dismantled Nazi operations in the Western Hemisphere during World War II, and how institutional erasure can hide genius in plain sight for over half a century. Because this isn't just a story about stolen credit. This is about how history itself was rewritten to erase a woman who literally taught the government how to break codes. And it all started with a young woman who just wanted to work in a library. On August 26, 1892, in Huntington, Indiana, a girl was born who would change the course of American intelligence forever. Her parents named her Elizabeth. And before you think that's a typo, it wasn't. Her mother deliberately chose that unconventional spelling because she found the traditional version imbalanced. That small act of rebellion against convention would turn out to be perfectly fitting for a life spent defying every expectation society placed on women. Elizabeth was the youngest of 9 children in a Quaker family, and from an early age, her intellectual abilities were undeniable. But this was the early 1900s, and her father held a belief that was tragically common for the time. He genuinely believed that college education was wasted on women. Think about that for a moment. He looked at his brilliant youngest daughter and saw her potential as worthless simply because of her gender. But Elizabeth refused to accept that verdict. She worked her way through Hillsdale College in Michigan, taking whatever job she could find to pay for an education her father wouldn't support. In 1915, she graduated with a degree in English literature, armed with knowledge and ambition, but walking into a world that had very specific ideas about what women were allowed to do with both. At 23 years old, Elizabeth traveled to Chicago with a simple goal. She wanted to work at the Newberry Library, hoping her literature degree would open doors. But fate, as it often does, had completely different plans. Instead of meeting a librarian, she encountered an eccentric millionaire named George Fabian, and this chance meeting would redirect the entire trajectory of her life. Fabian wasn't looking for a librarian. He was searching for someone with literary expertise to work on what can only be described as a pet obsession. He wanted to prove that Francis Bacon was the true author of Shakespeare's works through supposed hidden codes embedded in the text. Now, this Bacon theory was complete pseudoscience, the kind of conspiracy theory that wealthy eccentrics love to fund. But here's the twist that makes this story so remarkable. Fabian's estate, Riverbank Laboratories in Geneva, Illinois, would become America's first cryptologic organization. And Elizabeth, hired to hunt for codes that didn't exist in Shakespeare's plays, was about to discover she had a genuine gift for finding codes that actually existed everywhere else. At Riverbank, Elizabeth met a man named William Friedman, another codebreaker working on Fabian's various projects. Their relationship would become one of the great partnerships in the history of cryptanalysts. They fell in love, they married, and together they began transforming what had been considered a dark art into a rigorous scientific discipline. Now here's something you need to understand about this moment in history. Codebreaking wasn't really a thing yet, at least not in the way we understand it today. There were no textbooks, no established methods, no university courses teaching you how to break codes. It was viewed as something mysterious, almost magical, something that required mystical insight rather than logical analysis. People genuinely believed you either had the gift or you didn't. Elizabeth and William looked at that assumption and basically said, that's nonsense. They approached code breaking the same way you'd approach any scientific problem. You observe patterns, you test hypotheses, you develop methodologies that can be taught and replicated. While working on those ridiculous Bacon ciphers, they were actually inventing the fundamental techniques that would become the foundation of modern cryptanalysts. And then World War I arrived, and suddenly the United States government had a desperate need for people who could read secret messages. The only problem was that the U.S. government didn't actually have a code-breaking division. They had no dedicated cryptologic bureau, no trained experts, no institutional knowledge whatsoever. So they turned to the only place in America where anyone was doing this work at all, and that place was Riverbank Laboratories. Elizabeth and William suddenly found themselves training military intelligence officers and decoding hundreds of messages for various government departments. The pioneering work they did during this period, creating methodical approaches to breaking codes without knowing the key, laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. They were literally writing the manual as they went, teaching the government how to fight a war that was increasingly being waged in secret messages. But here's where the paths of William and Elizabeth began to diverge in ways that would echo through history. After the war, they moved to Washington, D.C. William joined the War Department, where his work would eventually receive substantial recognition and where he'd go on to become known as the father of American cryptology. That title, while deserved for his contributions, tends to obscure a crucial fact. Elizabeth was the one who pulled him into the field in the first place, and their early groundbreaking research papers were jointly authored. Elizabeth, meanwhile, took a different path, and this is where her story becomes even more remarkable. In 1920, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, ushering in the era we now call Prohibition. Suddenly, alcohol was illegal. And almost as suddenly, a massive underground economy sprung up to supply it. Rum-runners operated sophisticated smuggling operations using ships with radio communication to coordinate deliveries and avoid law enforcement. And because they knew the government was listening, they communicated in code. The Treasury Department had a problem. They were intercepting hundreds of coded messages from these smuggling operations, but they couldn't read them. They had no one on staff who could break codes. So in 1927, they brought in Elizebeth Smith Friedman, and what happened next was extraordinary. For the next 12 years, from 1920 to 1939, Elizabeth virtually single-handedly built and ran a code-breaking unit for the Treasury Department. Let me emphasize that, single-handedly. While William was working with teams at the War Department, Elizabeth was often working alone or with minimal assistance, deciphering over 12,000 messages from rum-runners and drug smugglers. 12,000 messages! Take a moment to absorb that number. Each one required hours of painstaking work, testing possibilities, recognizing patterns, breaking encryption systems that criminals thought were unbreakable. And she wasn't just breaking codes as an academic exercise. Her work led directly to 650 prosecutions. She personally testified in court in 33 cases, standing before judges and juries to explain how she'd cracked the codes and what the messages revealed. Among those few people who knew what she was doing, she earned a nickname, the Treasury's secret weapon. But that's the key phrase, isn't it? Those few people who knew, because cryptanalyst work, by its nature, had to remain secret. You couldn't publicize your methods because that would help the criminals develop better codes. So Elizabeth worked in obscurity, achieving remarkable things that almost no one would ever hear about. She worked tirelessly to demystify Cryptanalysis, to continue the mission she and William had started at Riverbank. She approached every code as a puzzle that could be solved through logic and pattern recognition, not through magical insight. She was building a science, creating techniques and methodologies that could be taught to others, transforming guesswork into systematic analysis. But even as she was doing this groundbreaking work for Treasury, even bigger challenges were gathering on the horizon. And when World War II erupted, Elizabeth would face her greatest test, achieving things that should have made her a household name. Instead, they'd make her a ghost. Stay with me, because what happens next reveals something deeply disturbing about how history gets written. When the United States entered World War II, Elizebeth Smith Friedman was in her late 40s, an age when most people would be winding down their careers. Instead, she was about to do the most important work of her life, and almost no one would know about it for over 50 years. The Coast Guard recruited her to lead a secret team focused on a specific threat: Nazi spy rings operating in South America. You have to understand the strategic situation here. Germany couldn't directly attack the United States across the Atlantic, but they could establish intelligence networks in Central and South America to gather information about American shipping, military movements, and strategic plans. These spy rings communicated back to Germany using sophisticated codes, and they were sending thousands of messages. Elizabeth's unit intercepted these messages and set about breaking them. And break them she did. Her team decrypted thousands of messages from Nazi spy rings, revealing their locations, their contacts, their entire operational structure. In one stunning achievement, she cracked a particularly complex cipher used by a spy network known as the Sargo Group. This wasn't just breaking a simple code. This was unraveling a sophisticated encryption system that the Nazis believed was unbreakable. Her work was so significant that the government immediately classified it at the highest levels. The intelligence she provided enabled American forces to dismantle entire Nazi spy networks across South America. We're talking about operations that potentially saved thousands of American lives by preventing intelligence from reaching Germany. This was work that directly impacted the outcome of the war. And here's where J. Edgar Hoover enters our story like a villain in a movie, except this villain was real, and he was one of the most powerful men in America. While Elizabeth was bound by secrecy oaths, legally forbidden from ever speaking about her work, Hoover launched a propaganda campaign that was breathtaking in its audacity. He went on national radio, he held press conferences, he painted dramatic pictures of FBI agents heroically cracking Nazi codes and capturing dangerous enemy operatives. He described in detail the brilliant code-breaking work that had dismantled these spy rings. Every single bit of it was based on Elizabeth's work. The FBI didn't do the code breaking. The Coast Guard unit led by Elizebeth Smith Friedman did the code breaking. The FBI sometimes made the arrests after being handed the intelligence, but Hoover told the story as if his agents had done everything from start to finish. And Elizabeth couldn't say a word. She was under oath. She couldn't write to newspapers, couldn't give interviews, couldn't defend her own legacy. She had to watch as one of the most powerful men in America systematically stole credit for her greatest achievements and built them into his own legend. The Coast Guard, unlike the FBI, never publicized their cryptologic successes. They operated in genuine secrecy, doing their work without seeking glory. So when historians later wrote about World War II counterintelligence operations, they repeated Hoover's version of events. Official histories credited the FBI with breaking Nazi codes, and Elizabeth's name appeared nowhere. Hoover's propaganda campaign was so effective, so thoroughly accepted, that even after the war, even after he died, the false narrative persisted. It would take decades before anyone would uncover the truth. Even in her relationship with William, who genuinely loved and respected her, Elizabeth found herself being overshadowed by his work with the Army during World War II. particularly his role in breaking Japanese diplomatic codes. Buildings at the NSA were named after him. Scholars wrote about his contributions. He became famous in the cryptography world. Elizabeth's equally important contributions were downplayed or forgotten entirely. When authors wrote about the Friedmans, the narrative was almost always the same. William was portrayed as the brilliant cryptoanalyst, the genius codebreaker, while Elizabeth was reduced to his supportive wife, the woman who stood behind the great man. The fact that they'd begun as equals, that she'd brought him into the field, that her own achievements matched his, all of that got erased from the story. In 1946, Elizabeth retired from government service. She compiled the scholarly bibliography of cryptography and worked with William on a definitive history of the subject. When William died in 1969, she continued their research alone, caring for their collection of rare books, maintaining their shared intellectual legacy. Throughout her later years, she remained characteristically modest about her achievements. Perhaps she was resigned to her erasure from the historical record. Perhaps, after decades of watching others take credit for her work, she'd simply accepted that this would how it be. Or perhaps she trusted that eventually, someday, the truth would come out. If she did trust in that eventual revelation, she would be proven right. But it would take far longer than anyone should ever have to wait. Elizebeth Smith Friedman died on October 31st, 1980. At the age of 88, her obituary in the New York Times was barely a paragraph long, and it focused primarily on her being William Friedman's widow, rather than celebrating her as a pioneering cryptoanalyst in her own right. The woman who had created American cryptology, who had taken down Nazi spy rings, who had built an entire scientific discipline from scratch, was reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. And her revolutionary contributions remain largely unknown to the public, still buried under government classification, still hidden by the false narratives that J. Edgar Hoover had created decades earlier. It seemed like her story would die with her. Lost to history, one more woman whose achievements were deemed less important than giving credit to the men around her. In 2008, 28 years after Elizabeth's death, the government finally declassified her World War II work. Suddenly, researchers could see the truth. They could read the actual reports, see the messages she'd broken, understand the real scope of her contributions. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Everything Hoover had claimed for the FBI had actually been accomplished by this woman working in obscurity for the Coast Guard. Then, in 2017, historian Jason Fagone published his biography, The Woman Who Smashed Codes. And finally, Elizabeth's story began to reach the public. People learned about the Shakespeare-loving poet who became America's secret weapon against Nazi spies and international drug rings. They discovered how one woman had invented an entire scientific discipline while fighting both foreign threats and domestic sexism every single day of her career. The erasure of Elizabeth Smith Friedman from history wasn't just a personal slight, though it was certainly that. It represented a broader pattern of women's contributions being minimized, forgotten, or deliberately attributed to men. While William Friedman has buildings named after him at the NSA, monuments to his genius, Elizabeth, who brought him into the field and whose work was equally groundbreaking, remained unrecognized for decades after her death. Today, we know the truth. Elizabeth Smith Friedman wasn't just present at the birth of modern American cryptanalysis. She was its mother. She didn't just break codes, she broke barriers in a male-dominated field while simultaneously fighting enemies abroad and erasure at home. Her legacy stands as proof of something we're still learning, that history is full of women whose world-changing work was hidden in footnotes, overshadowed by men who spoke louder but accomplished less. Elizebeth herself once wrote about codebreaking. There is no formula or rule which will unravel all secret writing. Patience, perseverance, and concentration are important elements. Those same qualities, patience, perseverance, and concentration, were required to finally decrypt the truth about her own monumental legacy. The codes she broke saved countless lives and helped win a world war. But perhaps her greatest legacy is this: she proved that genius doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it works quietly in basements and unmarked offices, creating the future while powerful men take credit for the present. And sometimes, if we're patient enough, if we're willing to dig deep enough, the truth finally emerges and we get to celebrate the heroes we should have honored all along. Her name was Elizebeth Smith Friedman. And now, finally, we all know what she did.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it.
That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.